just heard from Professor Harward kind of the legacy of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but at some point it had to get there. And at some point there were some very brave folks who were involved in the Department of Justice, very brave folks who were worked with the Department of Justice. And we have on the panel here David Lollis, who was very much involved in Mississippi, and working with and closely with John Doar. And I recently had the chance, David, to interview Robert Moses.
Yes.
And it was a thrill for me to have that person who was so much a part of the early 60s in Mississippi. And Reuben Ortenberg, who with the Department of Justice found his way through in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, all those states, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida, all those states which were referred to by Professor Harward. Maybe we'll just start with you, Reuben. How did you get involved in, connect with the Department of Justice? What's kind of your life's journey to get there?
Well, it's a very complex story. It started on a Tuesday night at 9 o'clock while I was studying. I was still in law school. I got a call on the other end of the phone. The voice said, "Mr. Ortenberg, my name is John Doar. I'm calling you from the Hotel Albert in Selma, Alabama. I'm authorized to offer you a position as a trial attorney with the Department of Justice."
There you go.
So that's not something that happened most Tuesday nights to me. I had a law school classmate, actually a part of my study group, who was well known for his practical jokes. So my response to John Doar was, "Did John so-and-so put you up to this?" And he said, "I don't know who John so-and-so is, Mr. Ortenberg, but if you're not interested in this, I have plenty of people who are." And so that was my first introduction to John Doar's voice when he was not pleased. Of course, I accepted the position, and after law school and before I was even admitted to the bar, I became a member of the staff of the Department of Justice. It was part of Robert Kennedy's honor law graduate program. He was trying to compete with Wall Street to get some law graduates to work for the Department of Justice. And it was a turning point in my life, and it was a great start for learning how to be a lawyer.
What was your assignment? So when John said, "Join us," you joined. Next thing you know, what do you really have to do?
My first assignment was to go down to Alabama. I was all of 26 years old. And I was given a team of FBI agents who, and we went around Alabama photographing voter registration records. Now, the copying wasn't with a cell phone, it was with copy machines about the size of the podium, maybe a little bigger. The FBI team of about 4 or 5 came in and took them about an hour to set up that machine, and then they started putting records through it, and I supervised, told them what records we wanted, and they gathered those records, and they were eventually shipped off to Washington, and that was done for every county in Alabama. And it was done as part of a case, and as a matter of fact, in conformity with the first part of the program about keeping records, I have here a copy of a complaint filed against Agnes Baggett, United States of America versus Agnes Baggett, Secretary of State, and the state of Alabama, alleging discrimination on the basis of race in the voter registration process. And this is a thick-looking document, but I have to say that only about 15 pages are the complaint, which is the allegations. The rest of it are examples of tests that voter registrants had to take in order to get registered. And I just made some notes here. There were something like 100 different tests with 399 different kinds of questions on government. And one of the arguments made is that although somebody determined that a 6th grade education was sufficient to qualify one to be a voter, this required a much higher level than that. And so part of the argument became education and unequal educational opportunities. So that's how school desegregation became part of the voting fight as well. And so I actually spent most of my time at the Justice Department working on school desegregation cases, but I started in this in this case, United States of America against Agnes Baggett. And I remember traveling down there on a plane, a two-propeller DC something, and having this in my lap and turning the pages, and there are a lot of pages of statistics, and the man next to me asked me if I was a politician. I said, well, no, it's close, but not quite that. So that was my first.
Let me just tell a story that relates to what Reuben has just talked about. I think it was 1961, we were doing some training of people that we were going to send back into their communities to begin the process of, and we never called it voter registration. It was always called the euphemism of citizenship education. This happened 2 years really before the Freedom Summer. So Bob Moses and several of us were trying out some of the processes we would use to train people how to go back in their community and then get people registered to vote. And I thought of it in relationship to the test that Reuben just talked about, because as well as training, I invited a guy named Eb Jennings. And Eb was a friend of mine from Port Gibson, an African-American man who was very impressive man, tall, thin, always wore a coat and tie. And he had come to sit in on the training of these young people that we'd gathered from various places in the state. And I said, Eb, share with the students what your experience has been in trying to register to vote. And he said, every year for 30 years, I have gone down to the courthouse at Port Gibson. And every year I've climbed those steps to the courthouse door. And every year I have gone in, catching the looks of people around me, and gone to the county court clerk and said, I would like to register to vote. And every year, without looking at me, she would push a piece of paper over in front of me, which was the test that I had to take to qualify. And every year for 30 years, I knew to bring my own pen and to sit down and carefully fill out that 2-page document, answering questions about the Constitution, asking questions about this citizenship. And he had a beautiful handwriting. Every year, I very carefully, for 30 years, filled out that form. And every year for 30 years, I took that form back up and handed it to her and bowed my head. And every year she said, without looking at the form at all, you failed again, Eb.
Did you find that experience, Reuben? And I see that you showed me that complaint, which had all those attachments, that it's the same kind of discretion as Professor Harder was talking about. Did that play out in your studies?
Yeah, well, this case, yes, very much so, where Professor Howard was talking about discretion in how you look in relation to your photograph. Yes, the allegation in the complaint included, for example, that everybody had to take the test, but that black people were required to take the test without assistance, and everything had to be exactly correct. White people that often were allowed to take the test with assistance and often were accepted even though they did not finish the test perfectly. So that's in my mind kind of similar, because it was clearly race-based. And I think it's interesting the way the John Doar orchestrated it is that he sent his people down there, and including the FBI, and they found white people who were likely to be voters, and they interviewed people. They interviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, and that's how they came up with the pattern that they were able to allege in the complaint, and then we went down and photographed records and proved every bit of it. You know, John Doar had a great, I don't know what you'd call it, I guess a slogan. You win your case with your ponies and their records. You know, cross-examination, like you see in the movies, that didn't happen too much. Yeah. But if you have the records, like Robert Jackson did at Nuremberg, and if you have your witnesses who can testify, as David just talked about, someone who I'm sure probably testified, you can prove your case. And that was, I have to say, one of the things, or one of the main things that I got from John Doar in terms of education of being a lawyer, is you have to be thorough. And you have to get all the facts. And then you have to express them and put them together correctly, but you can't wing it. You have to be thorough.
David, you were part of a group in the early 60s that was designed, and you tested program concepts that became Freedom Summer. You were under threats of indictment, of conspiracy, sedition, and violations of Mississippi immigration laws, you name it. Well, tell us a lot about that experience.
Well, I think that a lot of us at my age, I was 25, I think, at the time, and I had been working in the Department of Commerce, and I thought I was an economist at the time in the Office of Business Economics. But I was a conscious objector, and it came time for me to serve. And so I worked with my church to get an alternative service project. And I think there's a lot of interest in this point, too, that I was offered the position of becoming the director of the Mount Beulah Center. And I was way too young to be given that kind of responsibility, and I had no idea what I was getting into. But it was interesting. That had been, at that time in the South, there were very few educational institutions that served blacks in any case. But we had something called the Southern Christian Institute, CSI, that was sponsored by the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And then on the other side, that was in Edwards, on one side of Jackson, almost to Vicksburg. And on the other side, you had Tougaloo. Tougaloo really had a history with the Congregational Church. But at that time, we talked about this yesterday in the film, how much that Robert Jackson was involved in the voting. That time when that separate eagle was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, many people felt that we could kind of close those places. They would no longer be needed. You heard how much he was talking about the fact that we knew that one thing the Warren Court could do was make the decision, but it was another thing to implement this, what it is. But a lot of people in the country did not catch that point of implementation and just thought by magic it would be done. And so some of the support from the North that had supported these schools like Tougaloo and SCI began to diminish to somewhat. There was not a single institution of higher learning accredited by the Southern Association in the whole state of Mississippi at that point. Not one single one. Jackson State, it's a state school for blacks, the one Mississippi Valley, Alcorn, down near Port Gibson, none of those schools, Tougaloo wasn't either, none of those schools were accredited. So a black person could not go to an institution of higher education in the state of Mississippi to an accredited institution. And so there was a decision about the church people to let's combine Tougaloo and SCI and see if by combining them, their library, their faculty, and everything, we'll combine them all over and combine them at Tougaloo's campus. And by doing that, we did succeed in getting Tougaloo accredited. So the first accredited institution of higher education in Mississippi was Tougaloo, not a state school, but a private school, church-related. Now, I just say that to say that left this wonderful campus we had at Edwards on Old Highway 80 between Jackson and Vicksburg that had dormitories and at that time, if you're going to have a place like that that served blacks, you had to be able to contain yourself within a confined, gated area, because everybody had to live on the grounds. You couldn't be there if you didn't live on, you couldn't have people, everybody had to have their own home. You had to be able to be somewhat protected. As long as you didn't do anything that scared the white population, you could kind of quietly go about doing things out there that were understood to be to help the black community. So I got called down there to create a new program after we moved the education program to Tougaloo, to create a new program there. I was thinking that through. We're starting some things. We're starting some adult education. We're starting some things that related to literacy. We're starting some things that related to there were already beginning to be a significant number of black farmers that had little pieces of land they got a hold of some way. But the whole system in agriculture, the extension service, would never relate to a black farmer. So they couldn't get the kind of help that white farmers would get. So we created, because we had 1,300 acres of land, and I got a farm manager to come down that was really good, and we began to help train black farmers in ways to improve their productivity and to help them have better success. Little programs like that I started. So I'm sitting at my desk, minding my own business, and I see some cars pull up, and out gets Medgar Evers, a guy named Bob Moses, a guy named Ken Henry, several people that were in that were both from SNCC and from NAACP, and they said, we have this idea of creating a program for citizenship education, and we really want to begin to try to see if we can't figure out a way to break through and get African Americans registered to vote. And we'd like to try run it a couple of times here at Mount Beulah to see how that would work and see if we could do it. And so I said, well, that sounds like a great idea. So we started that process. That was about the same time Meredith was going into Ole Miss. And Ross Barnett was trying to create this aura of panic. And I can remember he said, there'll be a wall of flesh around Ole Miss before we let Meredith in. And I'd gone away to raise some money in Brooklyn at a conference. And I called home, and my wife said, I said, how are things? We just had our first child. And she said, well, I kind of wish you were here. They say they're going to burn the house down tonight. They said, there's the Jackson Clarion Ledger, major newspaper of the state, has come out saying Lollis recruiting communists at Mount Beulah. And that was part of the frenzy to build up. So they had heard that we were having some of these, and they found somebody had leaked some things we had that we were using, and to train people, and they published some of that in the newspaper, and they changed the heading to make it look like a form to become a member of the Communist Party. And that caused there to be a grand jury investigation. I was called before the grand jury. It was interesting because all up in that point, I would go down and sit with people in the coffee shop in Edwards that were white, the white power structure, and tell them, don't worry about what's going on at Mount Beulah. We're just doing some things to help black folks out there, you know, and don't worry about it. And but then when I got was brought before the grand jury, those same people were sitting in the grand jury box. The White Citizens Council, Ray Canada, and I were fraternity brothers. And he looked in a very different mood sitting in the jury box than in a coffee shop. And I was under oath, of course, at that time. And that led to 1 count of sedition, 1 count of conspiracy, and 6 counts of integration laws. And and Bob Moses, I remember, came over and was so worried about me. He was there when I got out of the grand jury saying, are you going to be all right? And that just, I think, sets the context a little bit of the kind of world we were living in. And I can remember one guy came to one of our meetings, an older gentleman, and he said, Bob Moses was sitting there, and there was some talk about Bob Moses, of course, being a communist, and he said, well, I don't know what a communist is, but if Bob Moses is one, I want to be one too.
I just want to make it clear that people like David and certainly the black activists in Alabama and Mississippi, all those places, those are the people who were in danger. There was never any danger of my house burning down. I lived in suburban Washington, D.C. I traveled down to Alabama with others. We all wore suits and ties. We had short haircuts, and we drove in dark brown or black Hertz or Ford rental cars that didn't have white wall tires. That means we looked like FBI agents. Often we were with FBI agents, and the people who made trouble down there didn't want to mess with FBI agents. So I was safe. People like David and the people who worked on those projects, they were the people who were not safe. They were the real brave people. I wouldn't count myself or my colleagues in that category. We were, you know, some of us, I had colleagues who were from the South who were disowned by their families for what they were doing, but they weren't in any physical danger.
Just to be, insert an excerpt about Robert Fine, who was also on this panel via video.
I apologize that I'm not able to be there with you today in person. I'm complimented that you've asked me to speak and to comment on the various questions that are on your mind. And I wish you all well for a successful day. And it was a historic time for the United States of America. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had been passed. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 had been passed. I was very much politically in sympathy and in support of both laws that had been passed. And I thought it would be an exciting time if I could get a clerkship with the Civil Rights Division at the Justice Department to see how it really played out in real life. So I applied, and I was fortunate enough to get that position. And so I went down to Washington to work as a law clerk in the Civil Rights Division of Justice.
As you, who was heading it up at the time? Do you remember who was the lead dog?
John Doar was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of civil rights, and I didn't work with him, obviously, as a law clerk, but he spoke to us, and we saw, when I say we, the law clerks in the division, and he was truly an inspirational man. And this was an inspirational time. John Doar was of the John Kennedy mold, and then, of course, Lyndon Johnson became president. And President Johnson carried on some of the programs, such as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that President Kennedy had set up, and John Doar was in that mold. He was a very charismatic and very inspirational man. And my recollection is that he was a modest man, talking more about the challenges of these laws rather than trying to take credit for things himself. I had the opportunity to have 3 different parts of my summer. One part was in Washington, working on various projects with various attorneys. That took about 1/3 of the summer. 1/3 of the summer was in Jackson, Mississippi, where the first statewide election was occurring after the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the other 1/3 of the summer was in New Orleans, Louisiana, where we were involved in a schools controversy in terms of what the New Orleans parish, they're called parishes in Louisiana rather than counties, in terms of what the legislature and the governor in Louisiana did with respect to schools. So there were 3 different components of my experience that summer.
Not necessarily an integrated area.
Not only integrated, but resisting and overtly No apologies, no explanations, just we don't like African Americans, and under the Civil Rights Act, they have more rights in terms of education than they previously did, so we're going to find a way around it. And they did. They closed the public schools. They rented the schools to a private school system. The private school system employed all the same staff, teachers, so on. To be a private school, they charged $500 per year tuition, and the legislature passed and the governor signed a bill granting $500 grant and aid to any student who went to a private school. Thus, the schools opened exactly in the same places they were, with exactly the same books and staff, and they didn't admit African Americans to the schools. That's what they did. The Justice Department went down to New Orleans, and their task was to declare unconstitutional what was done. And I helped, obviously as a law intern, as a law clerk, on a very minor basis, but I helped do some of the research, and I worked with the head lawyer in New Orleans, who was stationed there, and eventually it was declared unconstitutional. But looking back on that experience and thinking of the Jackson Center and Justice Jackson and his ideals, and just in today's modern society, even if you are a political conservative, you wouldn't imagine an action like the action taken in New Orleans, or as I'll explain, the actions taken in Jackson. I mean, it's just so far out of our milieu of the spectrum of political philosophy, and they were unabashed. You know, what did we do wrong? You can have a private school system. It was almost as if you couldn't find anybody who was taking responsibility for this. You'd walk through the halls, and essentially it was, as I recall, less interaction with officials and more just going to court, because there was no way of talking them out of this. They had passed the law, the governor had signed it, so there was no way to move forward. Yes. Well, Jackson, Mississippi, Mississippi was having the first statewide election since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in Jackson, and more so in Jackson than in New Orleans, when you were from the federal government, you were clearly noticeable. First of all, you carried a briefcase. Second of all, you wore a suit. And we always, for some reason I'm not aware of, Mercury was then a car, and we drove black four-door Mercuries. So when people at the city or county hall saw a black Mercury pull up, and 2 or 3 people jumped out in suits with briefcases, they scattered.
You probably were all white.
We were all white.
Yep.
All white. And they made no bones about it, and you used the N-word earlier, so I will, as much as you hate it and I hate it. But there was a central person there, a sheriff, who said, we don't like niggers down here. You don't like them up north either, but you don't admit it. We admit it. And we were there to explain to him that he had to permit African Americans to register to vote. And his response was, I'm not going to do that because I'm up for re-election next year. And if I run for re-election and I've permitted niggers to vote, I won't get reelected. So here's what you're going to do, and I know you're going to do it. You're going to go to court. You're going to get a federal judge to sign an order requiring me to permit them to vote, and then I will. And then when I run for re-election, I will explain to my constituents that I refuse to let them vote, but I was forced by federal order to do it, and I still object to it. And I'll win.
So what was your reaction to all that? I mean, you listen to this presentation, do you say, all right, that's a game plan, or do you say, that's absurd?
Well, remember, I was a law clerk, so I didn't say much. The lawyer I was with there was a very interesting man, J. Harold Flannery. I remember him well. Everybody called him Nick. Very well-dressed, very sharp-looking guy. He had a very well-trimmed mustache, very articulate. And Nick Flannery, who later went on to become an appellate judge in Massachusetts, and was just a real intellect. He tried intellectually to persuade the sheriff that it didn't matter if he liked or disliked certain peoples. This was a constitutional right of an American. And I watched him, and he was a very persuasive man. And he got nowhere. So off to court we went. And succeeded. One day, I woke up and I was really sick. I had a bad flu. And I was not in great shape at all. And I said to Nick, I don't think I can get out of bed and go help you today. I mean, I just can't operate here. I'm in trouble. I said, as a matter of fact, I feel so bad. Would you get me a doctor? And he said to me, if you want me to get you a doctor, I will. But if I were a young, Jewish law student from New York State working for the federal government to get African Americans to vote, I wouldn't want a doctor from Jackson, Mississippi to come in here and give me a shot. I think what I would recommend is I think you should just lie there till you feel better. And if you'd like, I'll get you some aspirin. And I've never forgot that story. And needless to say, my appearance here today is an indication that I took the good advice of Nick Flannery. That's a true story.
Is that a shock value to a guy from Buffalo, New York? Because that's simply not the culture here.
That wasn't a shock value because we knew from television and newspapers that that existed, you know, whites-only bathrooms and so on. So it really wasn't shocking to see that. What was shocking was the attitude of the officials and the attitude of people. I mean, we used to stay at Holiday Inns. When you check in, walking in with your briefcase and wearing a suit and tie, the disdain with which they looked at you, the attitude, and people really didn't want to talk to us. And I mean, that kind of attitude, there didn't have to be words. Somebody would look at you as you'd walk down the street and there'd be hatred in their eyes. There were a couple of times, not many, a couple of times where you felt physically concerned that somebody would attack you, but not to a great extent. I mean, they hated the federal government, but they were afraid of the federal government. And so it was, I think, the attitudes more than the physical facilities that you would see.
Jackson was the location of the University of Mississippi. James Meredith had been part of that integration, as had John Doar leading that just a few years earlier when the federal government did come in with a vengeance. Did you get a sense that 5 years later that still resonated?
I don't know that the James Meredith situation resonated, but the attitude of the federal government resonated. I mean, if you were from the federal government, you were the enemy. You were there to force us to do things we don't want to do. So that attitude resonated, not a single act. But remember, there were other acts, you know, George Wallace standing in the door, and, you know, I mean, there were many different acts in different states as well.
As you sit here today and you had this incredible eye-opening experience, I suspect, in 1967, how did that impact your views, maybe of the law, views of the use of the law, the rule of law, its implementation? What was the legacy for you of that 1 year in 1967?
Well, for a while there was a feeling of some guilt. Why didn't I go back and try to get a job as a lawyer in the Civil Rights Division and devote my life, or part of my life, to trying to help that cause? Eventually I got over that guilt because I found I had great interest in other areas of the law. When I got out of law school, I clerked at the Appellate Division, 4th Department in Rochester, and saw many areas, and eventually wound up doing, as I still do, business law and estates law, which probably is about as far from civil rights litigation as you can get. But I found I liked so many different aspects of the law. But in terms of political philosophy, I think that has had a lasting impact. When I look at candidates for national office, for President of the United States, for Senate, for House of Representatives, and even some on a more local level, I'm very conscious of the civil rights of people. I'm very interested when there are Supreme Court or Court of Appeals nominees as to their civil rights record. I don't feel guilt anymore, maybe I should, about not being more active in participating in all of it, but I speak out strongly in favor of civil rights and cast my ballot and make contributions to people who still care about those issues. Certainly, even in the South, there isn't the kind of prejudice and discrimination that there was in the 1960s. But obviously in this world and in this country, there still is discrimination and prejudice. And it's something that continues to concern me.
Reuben, as a result, you were there in Alabama in early 1965. The Voting Rights Act had not been adopted yet.
Correct.
Which was August of 1965. And I couldn't help but notice this one little vignette, again from the source of all sources, Wikipedia. And it talked about President Lyndon B. Johnson recognized that despite all the lobbying from civil rights leaders, the act did not prohibit most forms of voter discrimination. This was the Act of '64. So President Lyndon Johnson, having recognized that, shortly after the 1964 elections, in which the Democrats gained overwhelming majorities in both chambers of Congress, he privately instructed Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach to draft, quote, the goddamnedest, toughest Voting Rights Act that you can. And they did so, and they passed it. Do you get a sense that, first of all, some of your studies actually probably came part of the information that led to that, but here we are today. We heard Professor Harward sort of do a legacy of the 1965 Act. And are there a variety of unintended consequences as a result of what happened there?
What do you mean?
From the Voting Rights Act, which had a specifically dealing with the blacks, but here it's gotten various.
Well, I mean, the stated intended consequence was to eliminate racial discrimination in registration and voting. It did that. It did it much faster than it would have happened if it was just done on a case-by-case basis. We would bring cases, usually lose at the district court level because the district court judge was a local who was often racially motivated, and then we went on appeal. And so case by case by case we won. But if it happened in that way across the whole South, it probably would have taken 300 years to accomplish what the Voting Rights Act accomplished. So what the Voting Rights Act did was it made, first of all, it identified in Section 4 what parts of the country to which it was applicable, and second, it sent in federal registrars. The registration of people without regard to race was no longer left to local registrars. It was taken away from them. An army of federal registrars went in there, and they observed everything. Everything was being run from Washington. That is an unbelievably dramatic change in how things worked, and it only worked in those specific states and not even in all those states. So essentially what the Supreme Court just said in the Shelby County case is that there's no reason to believe that the reason for this unusual device still exists in those states, and therefore said that unless the Congress somehow either changes the law or somehow we're shown that the reason still exists, there's no longer a reason for it. Justice Ginsburg said, you know, that's like saying there's no longer a need for an order of protection because the man doesn't beat his wife anymore. Well, the idea is that the reason he doesn't beat his wife is because of the order of protection. Why take away that defense that she had? And so you can understand the reasoning of the Supreme Court, but it really makes no sense, especially in view of the fact that even before the Shelby County case, there are all these voter ID cases, and where people were bragging that it was going to have the very effect that it is now being complained of. You know, it reminds me of the poll tax cases which we were involved with. The Voting Rights Act authorized and directed the Justice Department to sue any state that had a poll tax. That was for those of you who don't know about that, a poll tax was a tax you had to pay for the privilege of registering to vote. It was, let's say in Virginia, I think it was $1.50, just $1.50. And it had to be paid for the 3 previous years prior to your registration. But the poll tax laws specifically said that you couldn't be prosecuted for not paying it until 3 years later, until it didn't make any sense because it wouldn't affect the voting. So it was purely a device to get people or to prevent people from voting, and the likelihood was that white people could pay the money, black people would not. And that's what happened. As soon as the poll tax was eliminated in the several states, I think there were 6 or 7 of them, registration by black people increased dramatically, along with the registrar system. So,
Greg, yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, that's, I think it's so important, and the only point I want to emphasize too is that you can't imagine, you talk about voting rights, you talk about registering to vote, you talk about being able to cast your vote. But let me just say that I was absolutely shocked by what a community is like before the Voting Rights Act and what a community was like after the Voting Rights Act. It was something you could just feel in the air, something you would feel as you walk down the street. I'll do just 2 quick examples. Edwards, Mississippi was really a place where there was about the same number of whites as blacks. Same thing was true in Port Gibson, Mississippi. And before, if a black person walked down the street and a white person came, you stepped off the street. If you bowed, you gave great deference to people. If you were running a little place that was like, there was a place called T's Kitchen. If you're running a place like T's Kitchen, you are always being harassed by the health department and everything else to make sure you were being kept in line, because she was serving the black community. After the Voting Rights Act, I go back, and the woman who ran T's Kitchen has just been elected mayor of Vicksburg. I mean, mayor of Edwards, Mississippi. The first time you go in, if you go into Port Gibson now, you don't see very many white people on the street, the people there doing things and making that community alive and vibrant are African American people running that town. Now, you'll see a white guy come through on his truck. You'll see other things around that are still making some money off of it. But the impact of that one act absolutely, completely changes the nature of a community. And it's palpable about how that occurs.
If you look at the back of Travel and Leisure magazine or other travel magazines, you'll see ads from Selma, Alabama. Come to Selma, Alabama and visit the Edmund Pettus Bridge where civil rights history was made.
Yeah.
It's an object of pride now. That is incredible because in some of the parts of the South, Alabama and Mississippi especially, the black population was larger than the white population. And so once those people voted, they got real representation. They voted for the people they wanted to. Now, you know, there are other cases now working their way through the courts involving gerrymandering, changing of district lines, and the question is whether that can be done or how that can be done without violating the Voting Rights Act. Professor Howard didn't touch on that, but that's another big subject that's on the horizon that's coming up.
Yes.
That's going to be interesting to see.
I want to mention one other thing, too, for the attorneys that are here. There was something in Mississippi called the State Sovereignty Commission. It was created by legislation that created a State Sovereignty Commission. And that commission had incredible powers to keep records on anybody that was beginning to move in a direction toward things that would begin some advantages to the African American community. And you would get a file, and they would do wiretappings. I'm sure this was illegal because it was federal, they would open people's mail. And I know this for a fact because they opened mine. And so it was a police state that was just watching everything, and there were informants. I finally, after I left and left under indictment, several years later, I was able to get my file under the Open Records Act from the State Sovereignty Commission, those records now, and I was just shocked at how many people had informed on me that were in there, and how much, and phone conversations and mail, as I said. So that power of the state also is gone because of what was done with the Voting Rights Act. But that was there, and it was so pervasive over every part of your life.
The good news, David, I got David Foley up here, the Chautauqua County District Attorney, and we're going to cover you for any extradition issues. Got that covered, don't we?
Thank you.
Yeah. As we draw closure to this incredible opportunity to talk to folks who were part of this, I mean, you were participants. Brian and I can talk about it from an academic perspective, but kind of what's the legacy, Reuben, of maybe your participation, but as you see it today?
Well, I think it's mixed. I myself have mixed feelings because I was kind of stunned hearing John Doar talk about how the race problem had been solved. Of course, he said that as part of the euphoria of the election of a black man as president of the United States. I understand that. But we've learned recently in Missouri and Maryland that the race problem has not been solved. I think maybe the more correct way to say it would be that the problem of state-sponsored legal discrimination was solved. Yes. But as far as what goes on in people's minds and hearts, we're a long way from solving that problem. So it's a great legacy. I mean, certainly it's a movement in the right direction, but I think there's an awful lot left to be done.
I really agree with that, and I think that the election of Obama did make a lot of us euphoric at that point, and we're just in shaking our hands. Those have been through what a lot of us went through trying to get to this point. That was such a marvelous feeling of success. But now I see, you know, President Obama this morning, I think, has talked about this, creating this new program, My Brother's Keeper. It is something that I think we're going to see him as a person in the last part of his presidency and on in the future be really working at trying to do something. And I expect we'll see a new civil rights movement of some kind. I don't know quite how it's going to materialize, manifest itself, but with what's happening in our country right now in the cities that we're all aware of through the node, there is going to be a new movement of some kind to make the next steps. And I think that we all need to think how we want to be a part of that, what role we want to play in it. Anybody that thinks that a lot of the difficulty that Obama has had in getting certain things accepted does not relate to racism is just, I think, not being realistic. I still go through the mountains, I go through the South, and when a politician wants to be mad at Obamacare and wants to say they are creating we always have had code words in racial relations. And that is another code word that tells a lot of people that have never broken through their misunderstanding about humankind. They see that as permission to continue being a racist.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just thrilled to have Reuben Ortenberg, David Lollis here, Robert Fine, who you'll see in the, when you watch it on TV. These guys are the real deal. And for that, I thank you very much. Thank you.